lost wallet, a little girl, and an unexpectedly honest moment of resolution. What happens next will leave you speechless. When Zuri, a strong-willed kid from a neighborhood, is in trouble, finding a millionaire's wallet, she is faced with a decision that could change her life forever. But when the millionaire shows up at her school a while later, it's not just that as a thank you. What they discovered will leave you wondering still. What is stronger, wealth or integrity? The sun peeked through the worn-out curtains of a small, cozy apartment in Westbrook, a humble neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia. It wasn't a wealthy part of town, but it was full of life, laughter, and the kind of people who greeted each other with genuine smiles. Inside the apartment, the sound of sizzling bacon filled the air, mixing with the soft humming of a familiar gospel song. "Rise and shine, Zuri," called Kiana, her mother, from the kitchen. Her voice carried a gentle warmth, the kind that could ease any worry. Zuri yawned, stretching her arms as she blinked sleepily. The 12-year-old girl swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold, creaky floor. Despite the modest surroundings, walls with faded paint and a few old posters of basketball stars, this place felt like a haven, a safe space built with love. "Coming, Mama," Zuri replied, her voice bright with the kind of cheerfulness that couldn't be dampened, no matter the circumstances. In the kitchen, Kiana was busy flipping pancakes. Her nurse assistant uniform was already on, neatly ironed, despite the long hours she'd worked the night before. The lines of exhaustion were etched on her face, but her eyes sparkled with pride as she looked at her daughter. "Sit down and eat up, sweetheart," Kiana said, placing a plate of golden pancakes on the table. Zuri's eyes lit up as she took a seat, grabbing the syrup bottle eagerly. "You spoil me, Mama," Zuri grinned, pouring a generous amount of syrup over her pancakes. Kiana chuckled, leaning over to plant a kiss on her daughter's forehead. "And don't you forget it," she teased, but there was a seriousness in her gaze. "Remember, Zuri, it's not what we have, but who we are that matters." Zuri nodded earnestly, repeating the words as if they were a sacred mantra. "I know, Mama. I'll make you proud today." "Promise." Kiana's smile softened. "You always do." After breakfast, Zuri grabbed her worn-out backpack. It wasn't much, but it had seen her through many school days. She gave her mother one last hug before heading out the door. The chill of the autumn morning greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The neighborhood was already waking up. Mrs. Green, the kind elderly woman from next door, waved at Zuri from her porch. "Good morning, sunshine. Stay warm out there," she called out. "Good morning, Mrs. Green," Zuri replied with a wave. "I will." Zuri continued walking, her sneakers lightly tapping the cracked pavement. She passed the corner store, where Mr. Patel was setting out fresh produce. "Morning, Zuri. I've got some apples fresh from the market. Want one?" Zuri hesitated, but then shook her head with a polite smile. "Thanks, Mr. Patel, but I'm running late for school today." As she walked, her thoughts drifted to the upcoming math test. Multiplication tables ran through her mind like a loop. 7 times 8 is 56. 9 times 6 is 54. She kicked a small pebble along the sidewalk, lost in her own little world. But suddenly, something unusual caught her eye. A dark object lying on the ground, partially hidden under a pile of fallen leaves. It wasn't just any object. It was sleek, black, and made of leather. A wallet. Her heart skipped a beat as she crouched down, brushing the leaves away to get a better look. Zuri hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was nearby. The street was quiet, save for the distant sound of cars and the occasional bark of a dog. Her fingers brushed over the wallet's smooth surface. It felt heavy in her hands, heavier than she expected. Curiosity got the better of her, and with a deep breath, she slowly opened it. Her eyes widened at what she saw: crisp $100 bills, neatly tucked into the cash compartment. There had to be at least $1,000 in there, maybe more. Zuri had never seen so much money in one place before. For a moment, her mind raced with possibilities: new shoes, a real dinner out with her mom, maybe even some new supplies for school. But then, the image of her mother's face flashed in her mind. She could almost hear Kiana's voice, gentle but firm. "Zuri, it's not what we have, but who we are that matters." The temptation faded as quickly as it came. Zuri exhaled, closing the wallet and shaking her head. "No," she whispered to herself. "This isn't mine." She carefully rifled through the other compartments, looking for an ID. It didn't take long to find one. A driver's license with the name Darius Montgomery, printed in bold letters. Zuri's breath caught in her throat. That name was familiar. Darius Montgomery was a big name in Atlanta, known for his successful tech company and his sprawling mansion on the other side of town. "What is his wallet doing here?" Zuri murmured, frowning. Then she noticed something else: a photo tucked into the wallet, slightly crumpled around the edges. It was a picture of a young boy, no older than 5, smiling brightly at the camera. The sight of the boy's joyful face stirred something in Zuri, a pang of sadness she couldn't quite place. Zuri looked up at the sky. The sun, now fully risen, casting a warm golden light on the neighborhood. Her heart felt heavy, as if the weight of the wallet wasn't just physical. It was a moral weight, pressing on her conscience. With a determined nod, she slipped the wallet into her backpack. She knew what she had to do, even if it meant being late for school. This wasn't a decision she made lightly. It was a choice shaped by years of her mother's teachings and the values she held dear. She turned away from the school and started walking in the opposite direction, towards downtown Atlanta. The tall buildings in the distance seemed to stretch into the sky, a world apart from her own neighborhood. It would be a long walk, and she'd probably get in trouble for being late. But that didn't matter. What mattered was doing the right thing. As she walked, she couldn't help but wonder about the boy in the photo. Who was he? And why did Darius Montgomery keep this picture so close? Questions filled her mind, but she pushed them aside. There would be time for answers later. The morning air was crisp, and the streets grew busier as she got closer to downtown. People in suits rushed past her, their eyes glued to their phones, oblivious to the young girl making her way, with a sense of purpose that seemed out of place among the bustling crowd. Zuri clutched the straps of her backpack tighter, feeling the weight of the wallet inside. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the person who lost it and the memories it carried. She thought of her mom, the sacrifices she made every day, and knew that this was her chance to show that she'd learned from the best. As she reached the foot of the towering office building, where Montgomery Industries was headquartered, Zuri paused. The skyscraper's glass windows glinted in the sunlight, reflecting the blue sky above. It was intimidating, but Zuri took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. The cold blast of air conditioning hit her as she entered the lobby. It was massive: marble floors, high ceilings, and a giant chandelier that sparkled like 1,000 tiny diamonds. Zuri swallowed hard, suddenly feeling small and out of place. But she wasn't about to turn back now. She approached the receptionist, a tall woman with perfectly styled hair, who looked at Zuri with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone polite but clearly puzzled. Zuri took a deep breath. Yes, ma'am. I'm here to see Mr. Darius Montgomery. I found his wallet, and I need to return it. The receptionist's eyebrows shot up, her expression softening, as she looked at the small, determined girl standing before her. Wait here, she said, picking up the phone. As Zuri waited, she glanced around the lobby, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. She had no idea that this small act of honesty was about to change her life forever. The receptionist, still on the phone, eyed Zuri with a newfound curiosity. Zuri shifted her weight nervously, clutching her backpack tightly, as if it held something far more valuable than a wallet. The tall ceilings and polished floors made her feel small, like a speck in a world too big and too shiny for her. She couldn't help but wonder if she should have just handed the wallet over to a police officer instead of bringing it all the way here. After what felt like an eternity, the receptionist hung up the phone and offered a small, surprised smile. Mr. Montgomery will see you now, she said. Take the elevator to the 30th floor. His assistant, Ms. Sophia White, will meet you there. Zuri blinked. He's really going to see me? She whispered, more to herself than to the receptionist. The woman nodded, her smile becoming a bit warmer. Yes, sweetie. Go on now. Just take a deep breath, okay? Zuri gave a small nod, murmuring a soft, "Thank you," before stepping into the elevator. As the doors closed, she was enveloped in a quiet hums, the kind that made her feel like she was floating. The numbers on the display climbed higher and higher, and with each ding, Zuri's heart pounded louder in her chest. When the doors slid open on the 30th floor, Zuri was greeted by a sleek, modern office space. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, making the streets below look like tiny ribbons weaving between the skyscrapers. For a moment, Zuri forgot why she was here, lost in the sight of a world she had only seen from a distance. Zuri, a voice called out, pulling her back to reality. Zuri turned to see a woman approaching her, Ms. Sophia White, Darius Montgomery's assistant. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that exuded confidence. Her sharp eyes softened when they met Zuri's. You must be the young lady who found Mr. Montgomery's wallet, Sophia said, her tone surprisingly gentle. Yes, ma'am, Zuri replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophia nodded, giving Zuri a once-over. The girl's worn sneakers and faded backpack were a stark contrast to the opulence around her. But there was something in Zuri's eyes, determination perhaps, that made Sophia pause. This way, Sophia said, leading her down a long hallway lined with abstract paintings. The walls seemed to hum with an air of importance. Each door they passed a gateway to something grand. Zuri's hands felt clammy as she followed, her mind racing with doubts. What if Mr. Montgomery thought she was lying? What if he accused her of stealing something from the wallet? She pushed the thoughts aside, reminding herself of her mother's words. It's not what we have, but who we are that matters. At the end of the hallway, Sophia opened a large wooden door, revealing an office that was bigger than Zuri's entire apartment. The room was filled with sunlight, streaming in from the massive windows behind a sleek mahogany desk. And there, standing with his back to her, looking out at the skyline, was Darius Montgomery. He was taller than Zuri expected, his presence commanding the room. His suit was perfectly tailored, a deep navy blue that spoke of understated wealth. When he turned around, Zuri noticed the lines on his face, soft yet stern, like someone who had seen the best and worst of life. Mr. Montgomery, Sophia announced, this is Zuri Johnson. She found your wallet. For a moment, Darius just stared at Zuri, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He walked slowly towards her, his expression unreadable. Zuri swallowed hard, feeling like a deer caught in the headlights. Is this true? Darius asked, his voice deep and resonant. You found my wallet? Yes, sir, Zuri managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. She fumbled with her backpack, pulling out the sleek black wallet and holding it out to him with both hands. I found it near the park this morning. Darius took the wallet from her, his gaze fixed on it, as if it were a fragile piece of glass. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. Zuri watched him, trying to read his expression, but his face was a mask, calm, controlled. Then, something changed. He pulled out the crumpled letter and the photo of the young boy. Zuri noticed the way his hands trembled, just for a split second, before he regained his composure. He stared at the photo, a flicker of pain crossing his features, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. How everything seems to be in order, Darius finally said, clearing his throat. He looked up at Zuri, his eyes softening. You could have kept it. The cash alone would have been enough to tempt most people. Zuri straightened up, meeting his gaze head on. It wasn't mine to keep, sir, she said simply. My mom always says it's not about what we have, but who we are. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, Darius let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He turned to Sophia, who was watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Respect, perhaps. Sophia, Darius said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. Could you give us a moment? Sophia nodded, giving Zuri a small smile before stepping out of the office and closing the door behind her. Darius walked back to his desk and sat down heavily, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. He gestured for Zuri to take a seat in the plush leather chair across from him. She hesitated, but then sat down, her feet barely touching the ground. Zuri, he began, his tone gentler than before. I want you to know that this wallet, it's more than just money and credit cards. The photo inside, it's my son. He passed away a few years ago. His voice cracked slightly, and he quickly looked away, blinking back tears. Zuri's heart squeezed in her chest. She hadn't expected this. I'm so sorry, Mr. Montgomery, she whispered. He nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you. This wallet is one of the few things I have left that reminds me of him. Losing it felt like losing him all over again. Zuri felt a lump in her throat, and she bit her lip to keep her own tears at bay. I'm glad I found it then, she said quietly. Darius leaned back in his chair, studying Zuri as if seeing her for the first time. You did something today that not many people would have done, Zuri. You showed integrity, honesty that's rare, even among adults. I want to thank you properly. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a checkbook. Zuri's eyes widened, and she immediately shook her head. No, sir, I can't accept that, she said, her voice firm despite the nerves she felt. Darius frowned, clearly surprised. But why not? This is a substantial amount of money, and it could help you and your family. Zuri took a deep breath, feeling her mother's teachings guiding her once again. I didn't do it for a reward, Mr. Montgomery. I did it because it was the right thing to do. For a long moment, Darius just stared at her. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. A real smile, not the practiced, polite one he usually wore. It was a smile filled with warmth, tinged with sadness, but also hope. You're a remarkable young lady, Zuri, he said softly. And you've given me a lot to think about. He stood up and offered his hand. Zuri rose to her feet, shaking his hand with the firm grip her mother had taught her. Thank you, sir, she said, smiling shyly. I'm just glad I could help. As she turned to leave, Darius called out, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Zuri, I'd like to meet your mother. I think she deserves to know what a special daughter she has." Zuri nodded, feeling a strange mix of nerves and pride. "Yes, sir. I'll tell her." With that, she walked out of the office, her heart lighter than it had been all morning. Little did she know, her act of honesty was just the beginning of a chain of events that would change her life, and Darius Montgomery's, forever. The sun hung higher in the sky now, casting long shadows as Zuri made her way back toward her school. Her steps were lighter, her heart filled with a strange mixture of relief and excitement. The wallet was no longer a burden. She had done what she felt was right. Yet, despite the warm feeling in her chest, a small part of her couldn't shake the image of Darius Montgomery's face when he looked at the photograph of his son. It was a fleeting moment, but the sadness in his eyes was something Zuri wouldn't forget anytime soon. She was running late now. By the time she reached the school gates, the yard was empty. The bell had rung minutes ago, and everyone was already in their classrooms. Zuri took a deep breath, bracing herself for the lecture she was sure to get from her teacher, Mrs. Davis, a woman known for her strict adherence to punctuality. Zuri slipped quietly into the school building, trying to make her way down the hallway without drawing attention. But as soon as she reached her classroom door, she was met by her best friend Layla, who was peeking out, her eyes wide with concern. "Zuri, where have you been?" Layla whispered, pulling her into the classroom. "You're so late. Mrs. Davis is fuming." I know, Zuri muttered, hurrying to her desk. She sat down and pulled out her notebook, trying to look focused, as Mrs. Davis gave her a pointed glare. "Miss Johnson," Mrs. Davis said, her voice sharp, "it's unlike you to be late. Care to explain why you're just now joining us?" Zuri's cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Davis," she replied quietly. "I was helping someone. It won't happen again." Mrs. Davis raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Instead, she turned back to the board, resuming her lesson. Zuri breathed a sigh of relief and mouthed a quick thank you to Layla, who just gave her a puzzled look. "Helping someone?" Layla whispered under her breath, leaning closer. "What do you mean?" Zuri shook her head. "I'll tell you later," she promised. Just as she was beginning to settle into the rhythm of the lesson, the sound of sirens drifted through the open window. Zuri's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of flashing blue and red lights from outside. Her stomach tightened with a sense of unease she couldn't quite explain. She wasn't the only one who noticed. The entire class went silent, and even Mrs. Davis paused, mid-sentence, her chalk hovering above the board. "Is there a fire?" one of the kids asked, craning his neck to look out the window. But it wasn't a fire truck. Zuri's heart sank when she saw a police car pull up right in front of the school entrance. A sleek black sedan followed closely behind. It was the same car she had seen parked in front of Montgomery Industries earlier. The police officer who stepped out wasn't just any cop. It was Officer Collins, a familiar face from the neighborhood. He had a stern but kind expression, the kind of face that made kids both respect and fear him. Mrs. Davis frowned, stepping closer to the window. "Everyone stay in your seats," she instructed, her voice laced with confusion. "I'll be right back." Zuri's palms began to sweat. Her mind raced with possibilities. Why were the police here? And why was Darius Montgomery's car with them? Had something happened? Did he think she had taken something from the wallet after all? Before she could spiral any further, the door to the classroom swung open. And there stood Principal Rodriguez. Her normally calm demeanor was replaced with an expression of urgency. "Zuri Johnson," she called out, her voice echoing through the room. "Bring your things and come with me, please." The entire class fell silent. All eyes turned to Zuri, who felt like she was frozen in place. Layla gave her a look of wide-eyed concern, mouthing, "What's going on?" I, I didn't do anything," Zuri stammered, her voice barely audible. She slowly stood up, her legs shaky, as she gathered her backpack. "Zuri, it's okay," Principal Rodriguez said, her voice softening a bit. "You're not in trouble, but we need you to come with us." Zuri's heart was pounding in her chest as she followed the principal out of the classroom. The hallway felt longer than ever, each step echoing loudly in her ears. She caught a glimpse of the other students peeking out of their classrooms, whispering to each other. When they reached the office, Zuri's breath caught in her throat. Officer Collins was there, standing with his hands clasped in front of him, a calm but serious expression on his face. And next to him was Darius Montgomery, looking far less composed than he had earlier that morning. His eyes were filled with an emotion Zuri couldn't quite place. Part relief, part fear. "Zuri," Officer Collins said gently, kneeling down so he could meet her eyes. "We need to talk to you for a moment. You're not in any trouble, I promise." Zuri's voice came out in a whisper, almost a squeak. "Is it about the wallet?" Darius stepped forward, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something raw, almost vulnerable. "Yes, Zuri, it's about the wallet," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "There's something very important I need to explain." Principal Rodriguez led them into her office, closing the door behind them. Zuri was directed to sit down, her small frame dwarfed by the large leather chair. She clutched the straps of her backpack, feeling like she might float away if she let go. Darius took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "Zuri," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "I need to ask you something. When you found the wallet, did you see the photograph inside?" Zuri nodded slowly, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Yes, sir. It was a picture of a little boy. I thought he looked familiar." Darius closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to hold back a wave of emotion. When he opened them, he seemed to have aged years in the span of seconds. "That boy," he said, his voice thick with pain, "was my son, Jacob." Zuri's eyes widened. "Was?" Darius nodded, swallowing hard. "He passed away 3 years ago. That photograph? It's one of the few I have left of him." The room went silent. Zuri felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her. She glanced at Officer Collins, who gave her a sympathetic nod, confirming the truth of Darius's words. Suddenly the importance of the wallet wasn't just about the money or the credit cards. It was about the memories it held. Memories of a little boy who was no longer here. I'm so sorry," Zuri whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." Darius shook his head, giving her a sad smile. "You couldn't have known. But that's why I was so desperate to find it. When you brought it back to me, you have no idea what that meant." Zuri felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. "I just did what my mom taught me to do," she said softly. "To be honest, no matter what." Darius looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something like hope. "And that's why we're here," he said, his voice firmer now. "I want to meet your mother. I think she should know what an incredible daughter she's raised." Zuri nodded, still trying to process everything. It was so much to take in. The police, the photograph, the weight of the wallet's true value. She had thought she was just returning something lost, but now it felt like she had returned a piece of someone's heart. "Can we call her now?" Officer Collins asked gently. Zuri nodded again, her fingers fumbling as she pulled out her mother's phone number from her backpack. "Yes, please. I want her to know, too." As Officer Collins dialed the number, Zuri took a deep breath. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, she felt like this wasn't just her story anymore. It was bigger than her, bigger than any of them. And it was only just beginning. Kiana Johnson sat at the small break room table of the clinic, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She was exhausted after a long night shift, her eyes drooping from lack of sleep. The hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of medical monitors filled the quiet space. She rubbed her temples, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was almost noon. Zuri would be at school by now, probably halfway through her math class. Just as Kiana took a sip of her coffee, her phone buzzed loudly on the table, startling her. She glanced down at the screen and frowned when she saw the number. It was the school calling. Her heart dropped. Parents never liked getting calls from the school in the middle of the day. It usually meant trouble. She answered quickly, her voice tinged with worry. "Hello? This is Kiana Johnson." "Miss Johnson, this is Principal Rodriguez," came the voice on the other end, calm but serious. "Everything is okay, but we need you to come to the school right away. Your daughter, Zuri, is here with us." Kiana's grip on the phone tightened. Is she hurt? Did something happen? Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Zuri had never been in trouble before. She was the type of kid who always followed the rules. No, she's fine," Principal Rodriguez assured her. "But we do have a visitor here who would like to speak with you. It's important." "A visitor?" Kiana echoed, confused. "Who?" "It's Mr. Darius Montgomery. He's here with Officer Collins," the principal explained, her voice gentle but urgent. "I think it's best if you come right away. I promise it's nothing bad." Kiana's breath caught in her throat. Darius Montgomery, the billionaire tech CEO. Why on earth would he be at her daughter's school? And with a police officer no less. Her pulse raced, with a mix of fear and confusion. "I'm on my way," she managed to say, before hanging up. She grabbed her coat, her hands shaking as she fumbled to put it on. Her co-worker, Marie, looked up from her paperwork, noticing the frantic look on Kiana's face. "Kiana, what's wrong?" Marie asked, standing up with concern. "It's Zuri," Kiana replied, her voice trembling. "I need to go. Something happened at school." Marie nodded, squeezing Kiana's arm. "Go. Take care of your girl. I'll cover for you." Kiana offered a grateful smile before rushing out of the clinic. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as she drove the short distance to the school. By the time she pulled into the parking lot, her hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles were white. She practically ran into the building, her shoes echoing loudly in the quiet hallway. The door to the principal's office was slightly ajar. Kiana took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever she was about to face. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing she saw was Zuri, sitting in a large chair with her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Relief washed over Kiana when she saw that her daughter was unharmed. But then her eyes shifted to the other people in the room. Officer Collins stood to the side, looking calm and composed, and beside him was a man in a crisp navy suit, Darius Montgomery himself. He looked up as Kiana entered, his expression softened by a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Miss Johnson," Principal Rodriguez greeted her, stepping forward with a reassuring smile. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Kiana barely heard her. Her eyes were locked on Zuri. She rushed over and knelt in front of her daughter, gently cupping her face. "Zuri, are you okay? What happened?" Zuri nodded, her eyes wide and slightly teary. "I'm okay, Mama," she whispered. "I didn't do anything wrong. I promise." "I know, baby," Kiana soothed, brushing a strand of hair from Zuri's face. She stood up and turned to face the two men, her protective instincts flaring. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why are you here, Mr. Montgomery?" Darius took a step closer, his face softening. "Miss Johnson, please, let me explain," he began, his voice gentle, but laced with emotion. "Your daughter did something extraordinary today. She found my wallet and chose to return it without hesitation. I can't begin to tell you how much that means to me. Kiana's brow furrowed in confusion. A wallet, she repeated, glancing back at Zuri. Is that true, Zuri? Zuri nodded, biting her lip. Yes, Mama. I found it on the way to school this morning. I knew I had to return it, so I took it to his office. Kiana's eyes softened as she looked at her daughter. Oh, sweetheart, she breathed, pulling Zuri into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you. Darius cleared his throat, drawing Kiana's attention back to him. Miss Johnson, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I don't think you understand. It wasn't just any wallet. Inside it was a photograph of my son, Jacob. He passed away 3 years ago. That photo is one of the few memories I have left of him. Kiana's breath hitched, and she pressed a hand to her chest, as if to steady her racing heart. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. She glanced at Zuri, who looked up at her with wide, earnest eyes. I didn't know, Mama, Zuri said softly. I just knew it was the right thing to do. Kiana felt tears well up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. She turned back to Darius, her expression a mixture of empathy and disbelief. I can't imagine the pain you must feel, she said quietly. But why are you here? Why bring the police? Darius hesitated, then took a deep breath. I wanted to thank Zuri properly. Her act of honesty? It's rare to see that kind of integrity, especially in someone so young. And I thought it was important that you knew, Miss Johnson. You've raised an incredible daughter. Kiana felt a swell of pride, so strong, it nearly took her breath away. She glanced at Zuri, who was staring down at her shoes, clearly overwhelmed by all the attention. Kiana knelt down again, taking Zuri's hands in hers. You did the right thing, Zuri. You made me so proud today. Darius stepped forward, his expression earnest. There's more, he said. I don't just want to say thank you. I want to do something meaningful. I want to set up a scholarship fund in Zuri's name, and I'd like to renovate the community center in your neighborhood. Kiana's eyes widened in shock. A scholarship fund? A community center? She shook her head, as if trying to clear her thoughts. That's too much. We can't accept that. Darius's gaze softened. Please, Miss Johnson, this isn't charity. It's a gesture of gratitude. Zuri reminded me of something I'd lost sight of. What truly matters in life. Let me do this, not just for her, but for your whole community. Kiana hesitated, her emotions warring inside her. It was a generous offer, one that could change their lives. But accepting it felt daunting, almost like a burden. Zuri looked up at her mother, her voice small but steady. Mama, maybe it could help a lot of people, she whispered. Maybe we could make a difference too. Kiana's eyes filled with tears again, and this time she let them fall. She nodded slowly, pulling Zuri into another hug. Okay, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Okay, we'll accept it. Darius let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Zuri's shoulder. Thank you, Zuri, he said softly. You've done more than just return a wallet. You've brought hope back into my life. Zuri looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and gratitude. You're welcome, Mr. Montgomery, she said, a small smile breaking through her tears. As they left the office together, Kiana felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. And as she walked hand in hand with her daughter, she knew that Zuri's small act of honesty had set into motion something far bigger than they could ever have imagined. The ride home was quiet. Zuri and her mother, Kiana, sat side by side in their old, squeaky sedan, both lost in their own thoughts. The gravity of the day's events hadn't fully sunk in yet. Zuri kept glancing at her mother, trying to read her expression. Kiana had her eyes fixed on the road, but her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel. It was rare for Kiana to be speechless. She was the type who always had words of wisdom ready, no matter the situation. As they pulled up to their small apartment building, Kiana finally broke the silence. "Zuri, baby, I don't even know what to say," she admitted, her voice tinged with a mix of awe and disbelief. "A scholarship fund? A renovated community center? It's incredible." Zuri nodded slowly. "I didn't expect any of this, Mama. I just wanted to return the wallet." Her voice was small, almost as if she still couldn't believe it herself. Kiana parked the car and turned to her daughter, taking Zuri's hands in her own. "You did more than just return a wallet, Zuri," she said softly, squeezing her hands. "You changed the course of someone's life today. And now, it looks like our lives might change too." Zuri's eyes widened. "Do you think this is really happening, Mama? Or is it just a dream?" Kiana chuckled, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "If it's a dream, I don't want to wake up." Just then, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name flashing across it. Darius Montgomery. "Mama, it's him," Zuri whispered, her eyes wide with anticipation. Kiana hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Mr. Montgomery," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Kiana, I hope I'm not intruding," Darius said, his voice kind but slightly strained. "I know today was overwhelming, but I wanted to follow up with you both tonight. I'd like to invite you and Zuri to dinner at my home this evening. I think we need to discuss this scholarship and the community center project in more detail. And I want to do it in person." Kiana's eyes darted to Zuri, who was watching her with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Dinner at a billionaire's mansion. It felt like they had stepped into a different world entirely. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Montgomery," Kiana replied slowly. "But we don't want to impose." "You wouldn't be imposing at all," Darius insisted. "In fact, it would be an honor to have you both. I'd like to show you my home, share a meal, and properly thank you for everything." Kiana hesitated for a moment longer before nodding, more to herself than to anyone else. "All right, we'll come," she agreed, her voice firming up. "Thank you for the invitation." "Wonderful," Darius said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I'll send a car for you at 6. See you then." As Kiana hung up, she let out a shaky breath. "Well, Zuri," she said, trying to force a smile. "It looks like we're going to dinner with Mr. Montgomery tonight." Zuri's jaw dropped. "His mansion? Really?" Kiana nodded. "Yes, his mansion. So we'd better go inside and find something decent to wear." The hours flew by, and soon enough, Zuri and Kiana were standing outside their apartment, waiting for the car Darius had sent. Zuri smoothed down her dress, a simple blue hand-me-down from a family friend that was one of her nicest pieces of clothing. Kiana had on a floral dress she usually reserved for church. She'd done her best to fix Zuri's hair into neat braids, and they both looked as polished as they could manage. A sleek black car pulled up in front of them, the kind of vehicle that looked like it belonged in a movie. The driver, a tall man in a crisp uniform, stepped out and opened the door for them. "Miss Johnson? Miss Zuri, please come right in." Zuri and Kiana exchanged a glance, both a little dazed. They climbed into the back seat, sinking into the plush leather seats. Zuri's fingers nervously traced the stitching on her seat, her heart racing. "This is really happening," she murmured. Kiana nodded, her own nerves showing through. "Yes, it is, baby. Just remember, you belong here as much as anyone else." Zuri gave her mother a small, grateful smile. She leaned back and looked out the window as the city flew by, the streets and buildings becoming more upscale the closer they got to Darius's neighborhood. Soon the car turned onto a private road, lined with tall, ancient oak trees. At the end of the road was a massive iron gate, which swung open slowly as they approached. Zuri's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the mansion. It was a sprawling estate with large columns and perfectly manicured gardens that stretched out in every direction. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. The car came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, and the driver opened the door for them once again. "Welcome," he said, with a polite smile, gesturing toward the open door of the mansion. Kiana took a deep breath, gripping Zuri's hand tightly. "Here we go," she whispered. They stepped inside, and Zuri's breath was taken away. The foyer was massive, with a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, casting shimmering light across the marble floors. The walls were lined with beautiful paintings and framed photographs. Zuri's eyes lingered on a photo of a young boy, smiling brightly. It had to be Jacob, Darius's son. Darius appeared at the top of the sweeping staircase, a warm smile on his face. "Welcome, Kiana, Zuri," he called, descending the stairs. He looked different here, more relaxed, almost at ease in his own space. "Thank you for having us," Kiana said, her voice steady but respectful. "It's truly my pleasure," Darius replied. He gestured towards the dining room. "Dinner is ready. I thought we could eat and then discuss the details of the scholarship and the community center." Zuri and Kiana followed him into the dining room, where a table was set with fine china and silverware that seemed too fancy to touch. Zuri hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place, but Darius pulled out a chair for her, smiling kindly. "Please sit," he said. "I hope you're hungry." Dinner was unlike anything Zuri had ever experienced. The food was exquisite. Tender roast chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and roasted vegetables that looked like they came straight out of a cooking show. Zuri's eyes widened as she took her first bite, savoring the rich flavors. "It's delicious," she whispered to her mother, who nodded in agreement. As they ate, Darius leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "I want to explain why I'm doing this," he said quietly. "The scholarship fund, the community center. This isn't just about thanking you. It's about honoring my son's memory. Jacob loved helping others. He was kind, just like you, Zuri. He would have loved what you did today." Zuri felt a lump form in her throat. She looked up at Darius, her eyes filled with empathy. "I'm really sorry about your son," she said softly. Darius nodded, his eyes misting over. "Thank you, Zuri. That means more to me than you know." Kiana reached over and placed a hand on Darius's, her expression softening. "You're turning your grief into something beautiful," she said. "You're helping so many people. That's a legacy anyone would be proud of." Darius looked down, clearly moved. "I just hope it's enough," he murmured. "It is," Zuri said firmly. "It's more than enough." Darius took a deep breath, then smiled. "I want you both to know that this is just the beginning. The scholarship fund will be named after Zuri, and we're going to start renovations on the community center immediately. I want it to be a place where kids can come and feel safe, where they can learn and grow." Kiana's eyes filled with tears again, and she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Darius shook his head. "No, Kiana, it's me who needs to thank you. And Zuri, you've given me something I thought I'd lost, a sense of hope." As they finished dinner and prepared to leave, Darius stood by the door, watching them with a look of gratitude and something deeper, maybe even healing. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, as they stepped outside. This was more than just a meal. It was the start of something new. Zuri nodded, smiling up at him. "We're ready for whatever comes next," she said. And as they drove away from the mansion, Zuri couldn't help but feel that the future, for the first time in a long time, was filled with endless possibilities. The weeks following the dinner at Darius Montgomery's mansion felt like a whirlwind for Zuri and her mother, Kiana. It was as if their quiet, modest life had been swept up into a story that didn't quite feel like their own. The promises Darius had made were not just empty words. He moved swiftly, setting plans into motion, as if fueled by a newfound purpose. One crisp Saturday morning, Zuri and Kiana stood in the center of their neighborhood, looking at the old, dilapidated building that once served as a community center. It had been neglected for years, windows cracked, the paint faded and peeling. Zuri remembered playing here when she was younger, back when it was still open and filled with the sounds of kids laughing and playing. It was hard to believe that this rundown place was about to be transformed into something new. "Are you sure this is happening?" Zuri asked, glancing up at her mother with wide, disbelieving eyes. Kiana wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. "Yes, baby, it's really happening," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Darius is making good on his word. This place is going to be a beacon of hope again." Just then, a sleek black SUV pulled up, and Darius Montgomery stepped out, looking less like a high-powered CEO and more like a man on a mission. He wore a casual jacket and jeans, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He waved at Zuri and Kiana as he approached, his smile genuine and warm. "Good morning," he called out, his voice carrying a lightness that hadn't been there the last time they'd seen him. "I hope I'm not late." "Not at all," Kiana replied, smiling back. "We were just taking a look, imagining what it's going to be like when it's finished." Darius nodded, his gaze sweeping over the building with a thoughtful expression. "It's going to be amazing," he said quietly. "I've brought in the best architects and designers. This place will have everything: classrooms for tutoring, a computer lab, a sports area, even a little library." Zuri's eyes widened in awe. "All of that? Really?" Darius chuckled. "Yes, really. And I want you to be a part of it, Zuri. I want your input on what the kids in this neighborhood need. You're the one who started this, after all." Zuri felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "I just found your wallet," she mumbled shyly. Darius knelt down, so he was eye level with her, his expression serious but kind. "No, Zuri," he corrected gently. "You made a choice. You could have kept it. You could have walked away. But instead, you did the right thing, even when no one was watching. That's what started all of this." Zuri looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. It was still hard for her to believe that her small act of honesty had set off such a big chain of events. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me." Darius smiled and ruffled her hair affectionately. "It's you who gave me hope, Zuri," he said softly. "Now let's get started. We've got a lot of work to do." As the day went on, volunteers from the neighborhood began to show up, ready to lend a hand in cleaning up the old center. There were familiar faces: Mrs. Green from next door, Mr. Patel from the corner store, and even grumpy old Mr. Simmons, who rarely left his apartment. They all came together, armed with brooms, paintbrushes, and an eagerness to help rebuild something important. Kiana stood back for a moment, watching the scene unfold, with tears welling up in her eyes. She saw the way the community had rallied, how they had come together in a way she hadn't seen in years. It reminded her of the old days, before the center had closed, when there was a sense of unity and shared purpose. "Looks like we've got a good turnout," Darius said, coming up to stand beside her. Kiana nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "It's more than I ever could have hoped for," she admitted. "This community, it needed something like this. We all did." Darius's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You and Zuri gave them that hope," he said quietly. "You gave it to me too." Kiana turned to him, surprised by the vulnerability in his eyes. "I didn't do anything special," she said with a small smile. "I just raised my daughter the best way I knew how." Darius nodded thoughtfully. "And you did a remarkable job. She's an incredible girl." Kiana felt a swell of pride, and she looked out at Zuri, who was helping Layla paint one of the walls, a bright, cheerful yellow. The two girls were laughing, their joy infectious. It was a simple moment, but it was filled with so much hope and promise. The work continued for weeks, transforming the old building into something new and vibrant. The grand reopening of the community center was scheduled for the end of the month, and the entire neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Everyone wanted to see the new place that had been built from the ashes of the old one, a symbol of the change that had started with one young girl's decision to do the right thing. On the day of the reopening, the sun shone brightly, casting a golden glow over the freshly painted walls and new playground equipment. Banners were strung up, and balloons in all colors bobbed in the breeze. The smell of barbecue wafted through the air as families gathered, chatting excitedly. Darius stood by the entrance, looking slightly nervous for the first time. He adjusted his tie, glancing around as if he couldn't quite believe the turnout. Kiana noticed and walked over to him, giving him a reassuring smile. "You look like a man about to give a big speech," she teased gently. Darius let out a nervous chuckle. "Maybe because I am," he admitted. "I've spoken at business conferences and charity galas, but this feels different." Kiana nodded. "Because it is different," she said softly. "This is about heart, not just money. And that's why it matters." Darius took a deep breath, seeming to draw strength from her words. "You're right," he said. "I've got this." He stepped up to the small stage that had been set up in front of the building, taking the microphone in hand. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward him. "Good afternoon, everyone," Darius began, his voice carrying a warm, genuine tone. "I want to thank you all for being here today. This community center represents more than just a place for our kids to play and learn. It represents hope. It represents a fresh start." He paused, looking out at the crowd, his gaze finding Zuri, standing in the front row with her mother. "None of this would have been possible without a young girl who reminded me what honesty and integrity truly look like," he continued. "Zuri, would you come up here, please?" Zuri's eyes widened, and she glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath and made her way up to the stage, her hands shaking slightly. Darius put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "This," he said, gesturing to the new community center behind them, "is the result of Zuri's small but powerful act of honesty. She returned something to me that was more valuable than money. She returned my faith in people, my faith in the goodness of this community." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering and clapping as Zuri's cheeks flushed red. She felt overwhelmed, but in a good way, a way that made her heart swell with pride. Darius waited for the applause to die down before speaking again. "And in honor of Zuri's integrity, we are naming this place the Zuri Johnson Community Center. May it be a place of kindness, learning, and growth for generations to come." Zuri's eyes filled with tears as she stared up at the new sign bearing her name. She turned to Darius, who was smiling down at her with a look of pure pride. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Darius knelt down, so he was eye level with her. "No, Zuri," he said softly. "Thank you." As the crowd surged forward, celebrating the grand opening, Zuri looked out at the faces of her friends, her neighbors, and her mother. For the first time, she realized the true impact of her choice. It wasn't just about returning a wallet. It was about returning hope. And in that moment, surrounded by the love and support of her community, Zuri knew that this was only the beginning of her story. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Zuri Johnson Community Center felt like a scene from a movie. Bright streamers fluttered in the breeze, and the air was filled with the buzz of anticipation. Families, local business owners, and city officials gathered around, their faces lit with smiles. It was a moment that brought everyone together, a celebration of something greater than any one person. Zuri stood at the front of the crowd, her hands nervously fidgeting with the hem of her dress. The dress was a gift from Darius Montgomery, a simple yet elegant blue piece that made her look older, more mature. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but today, all eyes were on her. Her name was now on the sign of the building, and the weight of that responsibility was beginning to sink in. Beside her, Kiana squeezed her hand gently, offering a reassuring smile. "You're doing great, sweetie," she whispered. "Just breathe. You belong here." Zuri nodded, taking a deep breath as she looked up at the sign again. Zuri Johnson Community Center. It felt surreal. A few weeks ago, she was just an ordinary kid who found a lost wallet. Now she was standing on a stage in front of her entire community, about to help cut the ribbon on a brand new center named after her. Darius stepped forward, taking the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, his usual confident expression softened by a touch of vulnerability. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice resonating with genuine emotion. "This center is not just a building. It's a symbol of what can happen when we choose to do the right thing, even when it's hard. And it all started with one young girl's act of kindness." He turned to Zuri, gesturing for her to join him at the microphone. She felt her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped up, her small hand engulfed by Darius's as he passed her the microphone. Zuri took a deep breath, the faces of her friends, family, and neighbors blurring together as she tried to find her voice. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "I never thought something as simple as returning a wallet would lead to all of this. I was just doing what my mom taught me, doing the right thing." She glanced at Kiana, who was watching her with tear-filled eyes. "I'm so grateful for everything that's happened," Zuri continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Not just because of the scholarship or the new building, but because it brought us all together. It showed me that even small actions can make a big difference." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering and clapping, as Zuri handed the microphone back to Darius. He smiled down at her, his eyes glistening with pride. "Thank you, Zuri," he said softly. "You've reminded us all what integrity looks like." He then gestured towards the large red ribbon stretched across the entrance. "And now," he announced, "it's time to officially open the Zuri Johnson Community Center. Zuri, would you do the honors?" Zuri felt her breath catch in her throat. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took the oversized pair of ceremonial scissors. The crowd fell silent, watching with bated breath. She glanced back at her mother one more time, drawing strength from Kiana's encouraging smile. With a swift, confident motion, Zuri cut the ribbon. It fluttered to the ground like a red stream of confetti, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Zuri beamed, feeling a wave of pride wash over her. She had done it. They had all done it, together. The doors to the center swung open, and people began filing inside, eager to see the new facilities. The transformation was incredible. The once crumbling building was now vibrant and welcoming, filled with natural light streaming through the large windows. The walls were painted in bright, cheerful colors, adorned with murals of kids playing and community members working together. There was a spacious computer lab with rows of brand new computers, a large gym with a shiny new basketball court, and several classrooms set up for tutoring and workshops. There was even a small library lined with shelves of books, donated by the local bookstore. Zuri walked through the center in awe, Layla at her side. "This is amazing," Layla breathed, her eyes wide as she took everything in. "Can you believe this is all because of you?" Zuri shook her head, still feeling a bit overwhelmed. "It wasn't just me," she insisted. "It was everyone. Darius, Mama, the whole neighborhood. We all made this happen." Layla grinned and gave Zuri a playful nudge. "You're way too humble, you know that?" Before Zuri could respond, she heard Darius calling her name. She turned to see him standing with a group of people, including the mayor and a few city council members. He waved her over, his smile as wide as she'd ever seen it. "Zuri, there's someone I'd like you to meet," Darius said. As she approached, he gestured to a woman with a kind face and gray-streaked hair. "This is Ms. Eleanor Patterson, the city's Director of Youth Services." Ms. Patterson stepped forward, extending her hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Zuri," she said warmly. "I've heard so much about you. What you've done here is truly remarkable." Zuri blushed, shaking her hand. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm just happy the community has a place like this again." Ms. Patterson nodded, her smile growing. "We're all happy about it. In fact, the City Council has decided to use this project as a model for other neighborhoods. They want to open similar centers all across the city, and it's all thanks to your inspiration." Zuri's eyes widened. "Really? They want to build more?" Darius nodded, his expression filled with pride. "Yes, Zuri. You've started something much bigger than any of us could have imagined." Zuri felt a swell of emotions: pride, disbelief, gratitude. She glanced over at her mother, who was chatting with some of the volunteers. Kiana caught her eye and gave her a knowing smile, as if to say, "See? I told you one small act could make a big difference." The rest of the day passed in a blur of laughter and celebration. Kids ran through the halls, exploring the new gym and computer lab. Parents mingled, sharing stories about how the old center had shaped their childhoods and how excited they were for their own kids to have the same opportunities. Zuri found herself sitting on a bench outside the building as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood. Darius joined her, sitting down with a sigh of contentment. "You did good today, Zuri," he said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "We did good," she corrected, grinning up at him. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Darius shook his head. "I think you give me too much credit. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That sometimes it's the smallest actions that have the biggest impact." Zuri looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words. "I still can't believe it sometimes," she admitted. "That all of this happened because of a wallet." Darius smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out that very same wallet. It was worn now, the leather cracked in places. He held it out to Zuri, who looked at it in surprise. "I want you to have this," he said, "as a reminder of how everything started." Zuri's eyes filled with tears as she took the wallet, cradling it in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, mingling with the distant hum of the city. It was a sound that spoke of new beginnings, of a community that had come together in a way that would never be forgotten. "Ready to head home?" Kiana called out from the doorway, her smile radiant. Zuri nodded, standing up and tucking the wallet into her pocket. "Yeah, I'm ready," she said. But as she looked back at the glowing lights of the new center, she knew she was also ready for whatever came next. Because for the first time, she truly understood the power of a single choice. The choice to do what's right. The days turned into weeks, and the buzz of the grand opening slowly settled into a comforting hum of everyday life at the Zuri Johnson Community Center. The building, once a crumbling relic, had become the heart of the neighborhood. It was a place where children gathered after school, where parents found resources and support, and where the community shared laughter, lessons, and love. Zuri was there almost every day after school, tutoring younger kids, organizing games in the new gym, and helping out wherever she could. It had become her second home, a place where she felt a deep sense of belonging. She often sat at the front desk, greeting people as they came in, feeling a swell of pride every time someone called it Zuri's place. One late afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun streamed through the windows, Zuri found herself sitting in the quiet library corner of the center. The bookshelves were filled now, thanks to donations from the local bookstore and volunteers. She was reading a story to a group of younger kids, their eyes wide with wonder as she animatedly acted out the characters. And that's when the little bird spread its wings and flew for the very first time, Zuri said, spreading her arms wide. The kids gasped, then clapped excitedly. "Tell us another one, Zuri," a little girl named Mia begged, tugging at Zuri's sleeve. Zuri laughed, shaking her head. "Okay, but just one more," she agreed. But before she could start, she noticed someone standing at the edge of the room, watching her with a smile. It was Darius Montgomery. "Mind if I join?" he asked, stepping closer. "Of course not," Zuri beamed, motioning for him to sit. The kids scooted over to make room for him, their excitement bubbling over. They all knew Darius now. He was a regular visitor at the center, always there with a kind word or a helping hand. Darius sat down beside Zuri, giving her an affectionate smile. "I couldn't help but overhear your story," he said. "You're a natural storyteller, you know that?" Zuri blushed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just like making the stories fun," she replied shyly. "You do a lot more than that," Darius said softly. "You make people feel welcome. You bring joy to this place." Zuri looked around the room, seeing the happy faces of the kids, the comfortable chairs, and the sunlight filtering in. It felt like a dream she never knew she had come true. "I guess I do," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Darius reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Zuri's eyes widened as he held it out to her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Darius's smile was warm and tender. "Open it," he encouraged. Zuri took the box, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the lid. Inside was a simple silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a heart. Engraved on it were the words, "For honesty and courage." "It's beautiful," Zuri breathed, tears springing to her eyes. "I don't know what to say." Darius gently took the necklace from the box and fastened it around her neck. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "This is just a small token of my gratitude, Zuri, for everything you've done. For me, for this community, and for reminding us all of what's truly important." Zuri touched the pendant, feeling its cool surface against her skin. It felt heavy, but not in a burdensome way. It felt like a reminder of the journey she'd been on, the choices she'd made, and the difference those choices had made in the lives of others. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, Kiana walked in. She paused when she saw Zuri and Darius, her eyes softening as she took in the scene. She had seen so much change in the past few months, not just in the neighborhood, but in her daughter too. Zuri had grown, not just in height, but in confidence and maturity. Kiana felt a swell of pride, so intense it almost took her breath away. "Everything all right in here?" Kiana asked with a gentle smile. Better than all right, Darius replied, standing up. He gave Kiana a nod of respect. You've raised an incredible daughter, Kiana. Kiana's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she walked over and hugged Zuri tightly. I know, she said, her voice filled with love. I've always known. The three of them stood together, looking out at the kids playing in the gym, at the parents chatting in the lobby, at the volunteers helping with after-school programs. It was a picture of community, of togetherness, of hope. Darius turned to Zuri and Kiana, a serious yet hopeful expression on his face. I've been thinking, he began, hesitating for a moment. I want to expand this project. The city has seen what we've accomplished here, and they're interested in funding more centers like this one, using this place as a model. Kiana's eyes widened. More centers? She echoed, clearly surprised. Darius nodded. Yes, and I want you both to be a part of it. Zuri, I want you to help us design the programs, to help decide what kids need most. And Kiana, your insight as a parent and community member would be invaluable. This project can be bigger than just this neighborhood. We could change lives across the entire city. Zuri looked up at Darius, her heart pounding with excitement and a bit of fear. You really think we can do that? She asked, her voice small, but filled with wonder. Darius knelt down so he was eye level with her, just like he had the day she returned his wallet. I know we can, he said firmly, because you've already proven that one small act of kindness can change the world. Kiana wrapped an arm around her daughter, her smile radiant. We're in, she said. Whatever it takes, we're in. Zuri nodded, feeling a rush of emotions, joy, hope, determination. She had started this journey with a simple choice, a choice to do the right thing. And now, that choice was growing into something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. They stepped outside together, the evening air cool against their skin. The sun was setting, painting the sky with brilliant shades of orange and pink. It felt like the perfect end to a perfect day, but Zuri knew it was only the beginning. As they walked down the street, past the neighbors who waved and smiled, past the kids who called her name with admiration, Zuri realized that she wasn't just a little girl who found a wallet anymore. She was part of something bigger, a legacy of kindness, of integrity, of hope. She glanced up at Darius and her mother, feeling the weight of the necklace around her neck, a constant reminder of her journey. You know, she said thoughtfully, I used to think that doing the right thing was just something small, but now I see how it can ripple out and touch so many lives. Kiana nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. That's the power of honesty and love, she said softly. It's the legacy you've created, Zuri, and it's only going to keep growing. Darius smiled down at Zuri, his eyes filled with something like pride, like hope for the future. The best legacies are the ones built on love and honesty, he said, and I can't wait to see where yours leads. As they walked together into the twilight, Zuri felt a deep sense of peace. The future stretched out before her, filled with endless possibilities, and she knew without a doubt that whatever came next, she was ready for it, because she had learned that the smallest acts of kindness could change the world, and she was ready to keep making those choices, one step at a time. Do you believe that honesty still has the same power in today's world? Share your thoughts on how integrity can shape our futures